An international major airline recently got hacked and credit card data was stolen. Here is the story of what happened before the hack. PaymentSandco.com was hired by one of the airline's suppliers to evaluate their PCI compliance status. This was about 6 months before the hack occurred. We spoke to the auditors and they all stood by their reports, saying there was nothing to see and that the airline was PCI compliant. Payments & Co.'s algorithm was applied to the airline's data, and what we found was indeed a horror story. We had a meeting with the client and this was what we told them. There were 3 critical risks that needed to be fixed immediately. Number 1. We found that CVV2 data was being collected on their payment channels and, more importantly, being stored on their systems. This meant that the merchant was not only non-compliant that year, they had not been compliant for at least 10 years prior. PCI DSS rules state, merchant cannot be PCI compliant if they store CVV2 data. Number 2. We found that full 16 digits of customer cards were being collected and stored on their systems, which meant their entire network was brought into PCI scope. This means it would cost them at least $20 million to achieve PCI compliance. Number 3. We found that they did not have an accurate asset register showing their payment systems and locations. They had POS assets that had not been used for many years, but they were still being charged for it. More worryingly, on the asset register, we found that there were many assets with software and hardware versions that the PCI Council deemed to be non-PCI compliant. Number 4. We found a high risk on their third-party suppliers because there was no risk management around the third parties, no control over the products and services supplied by the third parties. When the third party told the merchant they were PCI compliant, the merchant did not carry out any further checks and took the supplier's word for it. Number 5. We also found high risks at their payment channels with no controls around the changes that were taking place in their payment estate. Finally, we concluded that there was a high likelihood of card data breach occurring. The merchant did not listen to us and believed their highly paid auditors who told them they were okay. A few months later, the merchant suffered a card data breach, and it was one of the largest in the industry. Ultimately, a fine of over $20 million was leveled at the merchant. A class action from 420,000 customers was settled. One can only assume if each customer was paid $500 each, that could be a settlement of over $210 million. It was later disclosed that the entire IT security team for the merchant were fired. This should be a lesson to all merchants: get an independent verification of your PCI compliance and, more importantly, find out what your likelihood of a breach is.